Greetings. Welcome to the third class in the fifth semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. I'm Scott Kovacs, Executive Director of the Emerald Ensemble, a professional choir based in Seattle. The Emerald Choral Academy is a series of interactive webinars during which our area's leading professional choristers reveal their personal tricks of the trade to community singers. These webinars are then made available freely to singers across the world via YouTube. This presentation is funded in part by a grant from the Washington State Arts Commission, in addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, For Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the Washington Department of Commerce, as well as our many generous donors. We encourage anyone participating or viewing this webinar to make a donation as you are able at emeraldensemble.org. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our mailing list to hear about future sessions of the Academy and other activities of the Emerald Ensemble. This webinar is being recorded. By participating, you are granting the Emerald Ensemble permission to share your contribution. Your microphones and cameras will remain off during the presentation. You can ask questions to the presenter by typing into the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. Periodically, I'll interject to field your questions. Today's presenter is not new to the Emerald Choral Academy, and we're grateful to have him back. This is Ryan Bede, now making his fifth appearance. Fifth, is it five, Ryan? I think it's your fifth
I think
appearance
so. I think so.
with the Choral Academy. He's
Mhm.
taught on the faculties of Seattle Pacific University, the University of Puget Sound, and Tacoma Community College. He is presently serving as the baritone soloist and section leader at First Presbyterian Church of Nashville. He's also singing with the National Opera and teaches voice at Lipscomb and Belmont universities, as well as privately in the Nashville area. Did I get all that right, Ryan? Is that
You
all right?
did. Thank you, Scott,
Good.
so
And
much.
with that, I'll welcome Ryan back to the Emerald Choral Academy.
Excellent. Well, I'm so delighted to be back with you all this evening. Greetings from Nashville, where I understand it's about 15 or 20 degrees warmer than it's been in Seattle. But rest assured, I'll be joining you in the 40s and even in the 30s here pretty soon. Our fall is drawing right on, and we'll be heading into the wintry weather soon enough. This evening, I'm delighted to be here to complete the really pentagon, I suppose, if you want to call it that, of the 5 steps of the vocal process. We are our focus this evening shifts to the articulators, the final step that your vocal sound makes before it exits through your mouth and into the air, filling the air with song. The first 4 presentations of the Vocal Anatomy series dealt with the beginnings through the pharynx, which we covered in Vocal Anatomy 104. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see some slides here. So just as if you were to be undertaking a career as a medical professional, or if you are attending your yearly well visit or any other sort of visit with your medical professional, one of the first things that they do is something we like to refer to as a review of systems, just to go through all of the various systems that make up your physical bodily existence. And we'll relate this specifically to the voice. So the first step of the vocal process is the source of all energy that we need to sing, and that's the respiratory process. In short, the structures involved in the respiratory process, we take in the air, think about from the outside in, we take in the air through our mouth and nose. It then travels through the pharynx, past the laryngeal tissues, into the trachea, bronchial stems, bronchioles, and all of the following structures on its way down into the lungs. And the reverse is what we think about most pertaining to singing. How do we get the air to create the effect of bringing the vocal folds together to form sound, which is the second step of the vocal process, which happens at the larynx. We call the respiratory system the generator. We then use the term of the vibrator for the larynx itself. The folds do little else other than just to generate a raw tone at a certain frequency based on the length and thickness of the vocal folds. I'll just say a quick thing in review there. Think about your low string on a guitar and your high string on a guitar. Both of those strings are pitched at the note E, but they are in different octaves. Well, not only are the string materials different on most guitars, on the low string, you usually have a wrapped steel string, sometimes with copper or some sort of imitation product maybe, and then the uppermost string on your more expensive instruments would be made of steel, might be plastic in at least lesser expensive instruments, but the point that we care most about is that the tightness or tension of the string is more on that higher string, and it results, as you pull the string tighter, it becomes thinner. So when we have vocal notes that are lower in the register, we're talking about a shorter, thicker vocal fold. This is your public service announcement to remember that when we can talk about vocal folds or talk about vocal cords as in like same spelling as an electrical cord, but we don't want to talk about them as chords, C-H-O-R-D, like we would say a triad chord or something in music. But as the notes rise in pitch, the folds or chords get longer and thinner, and that the air vibrating through them, and there's a whole long discussion about what combination of muscle activity, which we refer to as myoelastic activity, some combination of the air energy that's supporting those folds doing their thing, and what the muscles are actually acting on each other to create the phonation process. It's important to remember as we dive into tonight that sound coming out of the folds is very raw. You can hear examples on a number of examples on YouTube, and a number of laryngologists have even videos on their practices websites. I can certainly follow up with some links. I didn't remember to do that ahead of tonight, but if that's something you'd be interested in, that kind of goes back to the sound generation lecture, and that's probably why it skipped my mind. But nonetheless, to be able to experience what that raw sound is, you would not consider that beautiful or pleasing or even singing, probably, because in point of fact, it isn't. It takes the next several steps of the vocal process to create a pleasing vocal sound that is articulated with consonants and different vowel shapes and all these sort of things. The next step after phonation is registration, and it's a fairly complicated explanation, but your takeaway for that can be you have two large muscles that govern which register you are in when you make vocal sound. If you're in your chest or full register, the muscle that's in charge is the thyroarytenoid muscle. If you are in your mode 2 or head or falsetto register, you are talking about a cricothyroid dominant sound. One muscle runs right through the fibers of the vocal folds themselves, and one runs kind of in kind of an embrace, I like to say, around the folds themselves, and which muscle is taking dominance determines the register that you're singing in.
Ryan, just a quick check, Ryan.
Please.
I'm not seeing any of your slides. Should we be seeing your
Oh,
slides
you're not.
right now?
It says it's paused. I don't know why. Your screen sharing is paused.
Let me just find out if that's something that I did.
How about I'll stop share? Oh, resume share. How about now?
I'm seeing a
Maybe if I,
screen that says
I'm so sorry.
loading.
Thank you for telling me. I'm
No, and I didn't want to interrupt you because it was so what you were saying was come flowing so lovely. So well. Could we try a screen share again? There
How
we
about now?
go. All right, now
Okay.
we're good to go, Ryan. Thanks a lot.
Oh, no problem. We were sharing, and then I think I probably tried to mess with a good thing, and then it changed it. So we're down now to the third level here, the third step of the vocal process. Our Emerald Choral Academy Vocal Anatomy 104, the last session was that of resonance. Now that's really where the sound begins to be developed from raw buzz, as we like to say, from the vocal folds into, we talked about vowel shape, we talked about vocal tract shaping and the difference between fundamental frequency. The frequency is the numerical representation of the high or low pitch. The example as a frame of mind there is always is A440, the pitch A that is a sixth above middle C. The standard tuning would say that that is 440 hertz of frequency of revolution, right? And just as kind of a review short of that concept, for every octave that you go down, the frequency cuts in half. So I'm a baritone. I sing a lot of A3, just a minor third below middle C. That's a regularly sung note for us, all male voices really, but especially medium voice males. That's in the kind of approaching the primo passaggio. So the rough frequency of that pitch would be 220. You go down another octave, we would be 110, and that would be A2 at the bottom of the bass clef. A whole octave below that, which is reachable only by specifically trained, often voices from the Slavic countries that have had certain training that they can get the really almost like subharmonic is a word that's thrown around quite a bit to get these low pitches, and that would be the A below. That would be A1. Most of you who are singers are also aware of the piano keyboard and realize that the very first pitch on most traditional piano keyboards is an A. We call that A0 because C1 is the first C on the piano keyboard. So if you can see your piano from where you are and you can see that bottom A and B, just realize that those would have an A sub zero, A or B sub zero, and then the first octave of C begins with C1, that third white key from the bottom of the piano keyboard. Okay, so that's frequency, right? And then we'll do you can do for yourself the math above the A4, as we have A5 is regularly used by women's voices. A6 is pretty high, right? If any of you know, there's a famous aria that we call the doll song from Jacques Offenbach's The Tales of Hoffmann. And in the last 10 or so years, it's become very much en vogue to even try to add a cadenza up to A flat 6, which is a minor third above the Queen of the Night's top F. So thinking about really, really high pitches there. The vocal tract mainly pertaining to the pharynx, right? We'll review some of this tonight because the pharynx is very much part of the articulatory system as well. But think about the resonant chamber, the vocal tract that is focused on resonance, beginning at the vocal folds and kind of ending, if you were to draw a line kind of right in front of your ear, right? That's kind of the resonance chamber. It's certainly not exact, but gives you a rough idea. And I mention the word filter because we think of the larynx being the source of the sound and the resonant chamber being the filter, the thing that changes the sound into namely vowel sounds. Now tonight, we're talking about the articulators, which are I say here, the lips, tongue, teeth, and the palate because of the structures that we need to say, pronounce the letter P, right? And the difference between the letter P and the letter B is really only one thing. It's the the activity of there being a voiced sound, right? We'll talk about this a little bit as we go along tonight, but you've had some wonderful International Phonetic Alphabet presentations in a number of different languages, talking about consonants, talking about vowels. So I know that there will be some, dually covered ground there. So we won't spend too much time on that. But the important thing here is that the articulators are sort of interrupters, but they interrupt in a good way because they change the sound from maybe a raw vowel into text, right? I'm going to start with a brief quote. There was a fantastic vocal pedagogue named James McKinney, who wrote a very well-known book called The Correction and Diagnosis of Vocal Faults. Well, that sounds quite fatalist and a little bit, concerning that a book's all about what's wrong with our voices. Well, I like to think about it as a voice teacher and, always aspiring to the next level of pedagogy, that we have the opportunity with every voice that we work with to optimize and make more efficient and maybe disentangle some things or take away some recruitment of other muscles that is not helpful, and not so much to fix problems, right? Not only do you go to the doctor to get a cure or a treatment for what's hurting you, you can come to your voice teacher or to your voice team with something that's bothering you. But at the same time, you can also go to your doctor with the desire to live healthier. You should come to your voice teacher with the desire to sing healthier and more efficient. So not to say that we look at it as if there's a deficiency or something wrong. Diagnosis is a very important tool when it comes to being a voice teacher, as is offering usually upwards of 8 or 10 different suggestive ways to correct what it is that's going on. But a very brief quote from Mr. McKinney. He says, articulation is the process by which the joint product of the vibrator, which is the larynx, and the resonators, which is the pharynx and the vocal tract, is shaped into recognizable speech sounds through the muscular adjustments and movements of speech organs, right? We want to be understood. We want to be intelligible when we sing. And articulation is what we need to make sure that we are, okay? Onward, we have 4 specific structures that we'll talk about this evening. We have the jaw, we have the tongue, we have the pharynx, because we're going to talk about how the pharynx interacts with these other structures. You're going to hear me use the words interdependence versus independence quite a bit. Independence, how does a structure function on its own? Interdependence, how do we take that function and combine it with other things to create something optimized for the singing process? Or, as we'll discuss quite a bit this evening, how do we get out of the way of things that these structures are normally used to doing so we can use them for what we want to do with them, which is sing? And then the 4th structure is something that we've all heard this word as singers, the palate, right? As I'll say in a few minutes, it is comprised of several different regions, but these are our 4 structures of the articulatory system, okay? When we talk about these things, we need to call into our awareness that there are body functions, most of them deal with respiration or digestion, that a lot of these articulation structures are involved in. So think about, for a moment here, just take a nice deep swallow and see if you can kind of be aware of some things. So you're aware of some laryngeal movement, a little constriction down there, and you really can think about the laryngeal tissues kind of, really becoming compact a little bit. Remember, the epiglottis closes over the top of the opening to the vocal folds because the vocal folds are the gateway to the trachea. So if the epiglottis doesn't close, the food that you eat or the liquid that you drink could proceed right down your windpipe, And we would not want that, right? We remember back to the point that when you feel like something went down the wrong pipe, or it gives you a bit of a cough, it's usually the epiglottis and the nerves that are contained therein that are being touched or rubbed on, and they don't like that, right? And that's why you get the reflex to gag or cough. But when you take that deep swallow, okay, you have something in your mouth, your body wants to make sure that that material, whatever it is, doesn't exit through your nasal cavity. So your soft palate helps close over your nasal space to make sure that doesn't happen, right? When your tongue helps move whatever material is from your mouth into the pharyngeal space so it can make its way down. Your jaw has a very important role in biting into a piece of food, chewing a piece of food, all these sort of things. So we're used to using these structures for other things. When I say airway protection, there's even a little bit of the role of the tongue to, gently guide that material to where it's supposed to go down the esophagus on the way to your stomach. Okay. So as singers, we may need to work against some of these things, right? We may need to think about how do we either activate or diminish the sounds travel, say, through the nasal cavity. One thing we think about a lot is a nasal sound versus a very dark, oscuro, maybe more throaty or woofy sound. Throaty and woofy and all these sort of things tend to have a bit of a negative connotation when it comes to singing. But as a comparison to nasal, forward, twang, brassy, all these sort of things, they're words that we can use to kind of make a denotation between the two. We may need to activate or suppress structures from doing these jobs that we talked about before in order to make them optimal for singing. Okay, so by itself, for instance, the palate, we can affect the palate because there's muscles that run therein to be elevated or depressed. We can do lots of things for good or ill with our tongue that can help us or hurt us when it comes to singing. We can do lots of things with our jaw that can help us or hurt us when it comes to singing. And I shouldn't say hurt in the way of injury. I just mean hurt in the way of impeding the ideal vocal production. Okay. But what's really important about the vocal tract and the acoustic nature of singing is that especially some pharyngeal muscles and the surrounding structures can really affect vocal timbre, right? And what sort of sound we're emitting. All right. First of all, we're talking about the jaw. And I'd like to just say a word very quickly about the anatomy thereof. You see on the skull here, I hope you can see my little swirl of my mouse, okay? Look at the area of the upper lip here, okay? This is what we call the maxilla. I didn't put a separate drawing with the maxilla marked individually. But what I want you to grab hold of here is that this is not a movable or jointed structure, right? It's directly attached to the skull. It's part of the skull. It's without interruption, a part of the head as a whole. So the idea of moving your upper jaw versus moving your lower jaw is a misnomer, right? The moving part of the jaw is the lower jaw, okay? We call this the mandible, right? I want to acquaint you with most, if not all of you, have heard of a temporomandibular joint syndrome, or TMJ. This is something that can affect singers greatly. Some of you maybe have had experience where you've needed to pursue some professional advice for problems in the TM joint, but that means the temporal, where the temporal part of your skull meets the mandible. The temporomandibular joint is right here. For me, it's about even with the top of the front of my ear there, where I like to keep my sideburns cut, right? Okay. So we're talking about the joint that's formed between the temporal part of the skull and the movable part of the mandible. Okay. So I want you to take a moment and I just want you to put your two hands on the side. I'll say this several times, and you've probably heard me say this before. Your cameras and microphones are turned off. So you should feel totally free to do these things from the comfort of your own living room and nobody's watching. You can't do yourself any harm. That's a beautiful thing when it comes to talking about things we want to do with our voice. You can't do yourself any harm doing this. I just want you to put your two hands on the side of your face here. And I just want you to gently open and close your jaw a few times. Okay. Think about the fact that there's an aspect of gravity that plays a role in your opening of your jaw. And there are stronger muscles that are responsible for closing your jaw. We like to eat, right? We need to eat. So we need muscles that are strong enough to help us do that. We have some depressor muscles, as you'll see at the bottom of the screen here, that are responsible for opening the jaw. But as you opened your TM joint there, somewhere, depending on where your hands were situated, somewhere along your fingers here, you could sense a little groove when you opened your jaw. There's, of course, ligament and tendon connections that abound through this part of our head because of all the muscles that are contained there. But you can really feel that space in there. I tell my singers a lot that the space that you need in your jaw for most of the register that you will sing doesn't need to be a whole lot more than that. I'm sure Scott and any other choral directors in the room or any choral singers that have had, I don't know, more than a decade or 15 years of choral experience, remember a time where there was an encouragement to fit a certain amount of fingers vertically in the front of your mouth. Usually that number was 2. I've even heard people say that they were told that it should be 3. Think about the height of 3 fingers. That's very tall. And that's actually undue stress on your jaw. And as we'll see in just a few moments, also undue effect on your larynx. Okay. So the mandible is the movable structure. The place where the mandible comes together with your skull at the top here is called the temporomandibular joint. Okay. We have the muscles that lift, we call those elevators. The muscles that lower, we call those depressors. Okay. What we mean by antagonistic muscle function, we have one muscle pulling against the other one. Okay. So think back to the respiration lecture. We have a paired set of intercostal muscles, one on the external intercostals and one on the internal intercostals. One of them helps a lot alongside the diaphragm with inhalation. It's the external intercostals, and the internal intercostals have their work when there's exhalation going on. So the internal and external intercostal muscles are antagonistic to each other. One engages while the other one relaxes. One, if you want to say, flexes while the other one retracts. These are all appropriate terms to use for muscle activity. This also is true in the jaw, okay? So you have 3 muscles that are in charge of elevating the jaw. They are called your masseter, your internal medial pterygoid. There is an external pterygoid as well, but we're dealing with the internal or medial pterygoid, and then what's called the temporalis muscle. So to become aware of your masseter muscle, I want you to take your 2 hands and put them kind of just right as if you had those wonderful Sir Walter Scott, Lucia di Lammermoor sideburns, right? And they came mutton chops, if you will, and they're right down here. So put your hands right there and then clench your teeth. You'll feel a little, I hope you could see that, right? You'll feel a little push on your hands because that masseter muscle is engaging. Okay. When you're chewing on something really crunchy or very hard, this muscle is especially important. Okay. We do, however, want some relaxation in that muscle. So in the same way that you just felt it contract or flex, I want you to just take a moment and just lightly rub some circles there. Okay. You can go clockwise, you can go counterclockwise, you can do a little back and forth. You're not going to hurt yourself. One or the other, perhaps a little bit more intense choices would be sort of a constant pressure sort of thing. Think about your foam roller that you might use on your back, right? Talk about rolling up and down with pretty good pressure. There may be a little discomfort with that, especially if you're a tooth grinder at night or a nail biter or any of those sort of things. These all put stress on the masseter muscle. Okay. I really advocate, and I put some stretch ideas on your handout, really doing some focus stretching before you begin your vocal tasks for the day. The internal medial pterygoid muscle is a little bit harder to access. It's reachable by the inside of your mouth, but if you extend your jaw down and you put your thumbs or your index fingers right below your cheekbone here, you'll feel that pterygoid engage. Nowadays, in the time that we are of being hyper aware of germs and things that are out there in the air, I always advocate for a really, really strong hand washing if you're going to think about doing anything in the interior of your mouth. You can open and close your jaw with your thumbs on the inside of your mouth and feel that pterygoid, and you can even do a little bit of self massage. That's the one I don't encourage you to be too hard on yourself because it can be quite painful. There are craniofacial massage specialists who can help with that if that's something that you're interested in looking into. The temporalis is a very easy muscle to release. So now I want you to kind of put on your Richard Wagner Valkyrie helmet hands here, right above your eyebrows on the side. And now do that same jaw clench. You'll feel the temporalis engage. Now just give yourself a light circular massage here, okay? Back and forth a little bit. Okay, and those are the laryngeal elevators. The laryngeal depressors, don't have a separate picture up for you here, but I certainly can add one to the resources for tonight. Realize that a lot of these muscles run underneath your chin, right? So the digastric muscle is a nice large one that's in the middle. We have the mylohyoid and the geniohyoid that also run in this area. Remember, when we're naming muscles or tissues, we're talking about where they start and where they connect a lot of the time. So if something is the sternocleidomastoid muscle attaches to the sternum in one place. You have the cricoarytenoid muscle in the larynx that brings together the cricoid and arytenoid cartilage and things like that. So when anything that involves hyoid, that talks about the hyoid bone, which is that kind of free floating bone that's behind the tongue, right? Okay. Digastric is simply called that because it's divided into two bellies. Anything gastric is stomach or belly, and di is two. Okay. When it comes to some release of these muscles, you can just do a little light massage underneath your jaw here. We'll talk about this some more when we get to the tongue, but that just gets in there a little bit. Realize that these jaw depressor muscles, to varying degrees, are two function muscles. While they are jaw depressors, and we like to open our mouth if we want to sing, we need to open our mouth if we're going to eat, but realize that under extreme, overextension, these depressor muscles also serve as laryngeal elevators. They will bring your larynx up, right? different laryngeal needs based on the aesthetic of the music you're singing. But from a Western classical point of view, most of the choral music you will sing, solo art song, Western opera, which still dominates most of the operatic landscape. We're talking about a lower laryngeal position, right? And that's one way that we can attempt to get out of our own way when it comes to singing, is not over opening or overly, opening with too great of an urgency or too sudden, right? Okay. As we move towards the tongue, pictured here, we have one of the most famous tongue references in pop culture history of the last 100 years. Of course, Mr. Gene Simmons with the long tongue here. Realize that there are both intrinsic, which means inside the tongue muscles, and extrinsic muscles, which are around the tongue and attach to places like the hyoid bone, to the top of the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, all kinds of things, right? There are both types of muscles. When we talk about the muscles inside the tongue, we talk about shaping of the tongue. There are four muscle groups there. And in his wonderful book, Your Voice and Inside View, Scott McCoy talks about these being a muscle sandwich, right? There are four. There are longitudinal muscles, which are paired, that run down the long axis of the tongue. We have a muscle that runs sideways, transverse, and then we have a muscle that runs basically up through the tongue, right? And these are the layers of that sandwich, right? Okay, that cause the tongue to be able to move. Okay, so think about I brought my trusty hand mirror on with me tonight. I think a hand mirror is an important tool in every singer's arsenal, right? Because you can take it right up to your face and look right down and see the structures inside, of course, because of the mirror effect. I can't show you what I'm seeing, but this is a good thing to do with your hand mirror in front of you. Just take a moment and just, in a very relaxed way, open your mouth, kind of think about letting your jaw wag a little bit and having your tongue, I like to say, kind of liquid in the bottom of your mouth, right? Tip of tongue behind your bottom teeth. That's called the apex, by the way, of your tongue, right? So when you have consonants that go with the alveolar ridge and the apex of your tongue, that's one classification system for those, right? Okay. So when we're talking about any out or in, up or down, up curl, curl up on the sides, as I'm sure our friend Michael Bennett has told you lots about the formation of vowels from an IPA standpoint. Realize that those are all extrinsic muscle activities, muscles around the tongue that are creating that phenomenon. Okay, so when it comes to tongue position, it's vital for the articulation and for our resonance, right? The idea of starting with ah and moving from ah to a, you're arching the tongue slightly, the sides of the tongue, you can feel them come up. From ah to a to e, you're arching the tongue even more with the middle of the dorsum of the tongue approaching the soft palate, right? So there's lots of motion and arch to the tongue. That is, by the way, also why we call those front vowels, E and A, is because we're arching the tongue forward. Okay, the arch in the tongue comes forward. For the back vowels, which are O and U, the tongue is arching somewhat backward, but we remember from our resonance discussion and where our tongues are supposed to be for vowels, that you really ought to keep the apex of your tongue very near the back of your bottom teeth for all vowels as much as possible, at least from a Western classical standpoint. We have to quantify that. But this helps in maximizing vocal resonance. We want interdependence. We want these muscles to work together, but we also want independence. So I want to do a few things really quick, and then we're going to take some questions. I want to deal with thinking about doing your best impression of Mr. Simmons here. right? I want you to think about pushing your tongue out, but I want you to think about it almost as if you were working for the fire department and you were rolling out a long length of hose, right? So you're just sort of letting it kind of spit out the front of your mouth, yeah? Nice and relaxed. You shouldn't see a deep anatomical differences govern a little bit of the shape of the groove in our tongue, but we don't want a real deep valley in the tongue when you're just relaxing it out this way. Okay. This is a great stretch to do after you do your jaw stretches. Just like other muscle stretches, hold it for 8 to 10 seconds. Bring it back in, recalibrate, maybe do it again. Okay. Then we're going to do a tongue curl. We're going to put the tip of our tongue behind our bottom teeth. And then we're going to rotate the middle of the dorsum of the tongue upwards. So it's going to look like this. Okay. Also 8 to 10 seconds. Shake it out, so to speak, like they tell us in calisthenics, right? And then we're going to do one for the underside of the tongue, where you're going to take the same apex of your tongue and you're going to put it behind your top teeth and push the middle of the tongue out. Okay. And then the last one we like to call the circular stretch. I give my students the analogy of kind of feeling like you're brushing your teeth with your tongue, right? So close your lips and run your tongue around the front surfaces of your upper and lower teeth. Don't go so far that you have to move your jaw a whole lot. So like this. You shouldn't see your chin moving around too much side to side, because that's going to show you that you're doing a lot of jaw movement, right? We can do a jaw stretch, like imagine that you're chewing some really chewy bubble gum, going around in circles. Let that grow into something that is opening your lips, so you're getting a little bit more range of motion. But then that circular stretch for the tongue really works with a lot of those extrinsic muscles. One, we need the right side to engage a little bit more and the left side to relax, to go one direction in the mouth and onward and upward that way. Okay, I'd like to take just a moment to pause for questions if we have any. It looks like I see a number in the chat box, so we might have a few.
There I am. I knew I was there somewhere. Actually, not so many questions. I think we've had most of the questions answered along the way. I thought I
Great,
might add one though.
please.
And if it's very tangential, but you were talking about
Okay.
reflexes, the reflexes of eating, the
Oh yeah,
reflexes of, right. So there are some reflexes that aren't quite so intentional,
yeah,
like coughing. What
yes,
happens when we have a coughing fit?
yes,
Sneezing is certainly another
yes,
one that will really confuse the
absolutely.
systems as we encounter them. So I'm not sure if
Okay,
this is a great place to talk about unintentional
it is.
activity. Maybe this is a great time
It
for
is.
that.
I'm so glad you said that. So let's think about the cough for starters, okay? So or even thinking about hiccup, right? We're thinking about, in a way, we're closing the glottis, we're closing the folds when we cough, right? When we cough, we're trying to clear something from the respiratory tubes that is irritating our ability to breathe, right? So when you cough, in all likelihood, your soft palate is going to cover off of your nose, so the air that is being expelled out of your upper chest past your larynx, and a closed glottis will exit through your mouth, right? So if you just do a light, like, right, just voluntarily give yourself a little cough. You feel it's just like, this is kind of like a puff of air passing the glottis. You're not really forcefully doing so. If you really you have that bug that seems to be infecting everybody this fall, and it's all just stuck there at the chords, clearing your throat and all these sort of things. That may be more of a close. I actually tell my singers quite a bit to imagine that they're going to hiccup, go like, right? And you just have a momentary closure to achieve, even like for onset of the sound, like we don't want to go and we don't want to go right? One is a hard or forced onset, one is a breathy or aspirate onset. And for most of what we're doing, we want something in the middle. So that's the cough, sort of the cough breakdown. Your palate would close off your nose. With sneezing, we're basically clearing airway only in the upper part here. And that's, not to be, too demonstrative, but it's amazing that type of effect can happen with just such a small amount of real estate right there. We're talking about your sinus passages and things like that. So your soft palate would actually depress. And if you notice when you sneeze, you go chew, right? When you go to sneeze, you can feel your palates close down your mouth space because your body is worried about what's going to happen with your nose, right? You try to sneeze with your mouth open, or you vocalize that sound too much. It's a bit of a traumatic thing to the vocal folds. So I mean, without being, I haven't said it yet, and I probably should. I think a good voice teacher puts this in often, is that I'm not a medical professional, so I'm certainly not giving you, medical advice or giving you the most salient medical information that you might find. Certainly not in a voice-specific laryngologist. But when it comes to encouraging you not to vocalize your cough too much, or clear your throat loudly, or put a large vocal sound with a sneeze, it's not just because it's not as socially encouraged, but it's also, it can create undue trauma to the folds themselves. So that's absolutely not, I mean, it's certainly, it's a good tangent that we just went on, for sure.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah,
I don't think anything else has come in while we
great.
were off on that actually really interesting journey. So
Yeah.
we'll turn it back over. Thank you.
We'll go ima vita, as I always like to say, always forward. Okay. So the next group of structures we have is the hard and soft palates. Okay. Two sections. The hard palate is called the alveolar ridge, and the other name for the soft palate is the velum or velum, depending on who you're talking to. When we talk about velar consonants, I'm certainly more familiar with hearing folks say velar, but I don't think velar is improper at all. These two sections make up the palate. If you want to experience this for yourself, take the apex, the tip of your tongue, start it behind your top teeth, and run it backwards along the roof of your mouth. You'll in most people's upper mouth anatomy, there are some ridges inside the mouth, and then you will reach a hard bony prominence, right? That together is your hard palate. If you go far enough with your tongue, and it doesn't incite a slight cough or gag reflex or a little tickle, which is certainly not unusual if it does, you've found your soft palate, okay? So these are very important for the swallowing process, right? When we want food to go down to our esophagus, we want to make sure it doesn't come out our nose, right? So the soft palate has to close over the nasal cavity, the nasal vault, the nasal space, to make sure that doesn't happen, okay? That swallow that I had you do in the early part of our session, it has tongue involvement. It has sort of squeezing pharyngeal involvement, not unlike kind of squeezing the toothpaste down the tube. And then we also have larynx involvement. Okay. So here I put yawn, laugh, and sob in quotes, because these are three things that you can visualize to think about different palate positions. So if you're going to yawn, if you got one coming and you've been trying to hold it off and it's just not going to stop, you're going to have, when we yawn, we raise our soft palate. So think of about you're done with work for the day, you've got a little peace and quiet, you're going to just yawn and sigh. Oh, when you take that nice deep yawn, you feel nice, cool air come in through your mouth. And that's because we spend a good amount of our time with our palate depressed. So the tissues back there are nice and warm from being kept nice and toasty by our lowered palate. When you elevate the palate, you're inviting fresh air into that area, and you might feel a little bit of a cool sensation. Okay, so that's the yawn. In an extreme situation, you can yawn or raise your palate to the point that your uvula almost comes up into what we would call the narrow nasopharynx, right? That is a deeper, more forceful inhalation, palatal lift than we will want for singing, right? But just to know that we can do it is a nice little, I sometimes, not so sincerely use the word party trick, right? There are things that our body can do and we can tie to the singing process in a certain way, but you don't need to overextend in that regard. Now think about a nice laugh, right? I have a bit of a fast-paced laugh when I get going. So, and I can really feel that that little you have not only a little vocal effect going on at the generator, at the vibrator, right? But you also have air passing through that palatal area. Okay. And if you think about like a real like a really sad sob, you've got a depressed palate there too. You may have an elevated palate as you ramp up for said sob, but there's going to be the puffs of air going past the soft palate are evident in the laugh and sob. Okay. So when it comes to singing, the soft palate separates the nasal from the oral space. Sometimes we want more nasal resonance, more forward focus. I don't like to use the word placement because we can't place our sound, right? It begins in the larynx, it's vibrating, it's resonated in the pharynx, more or less. So we can't say, I want this to be mouth sound, I want this to be nose sound, unless we block off one of the two. Okay. Sometimes we want there to be nasal sound. Like think back to our semi-occluded vocal tract exercises on our 3 ways to hum. When you have an M hum, an N hum, and an NG. These are all sounds that we know as continuants. M and N are nasal continuants, right? NG has a little bit more of a palatal involvement because of the tongue position at the top, and we'll talk about this at the bottom of the screen here in just a moment. Okay, but the act of humming requires a somewhat lower soft palate. Now we can think about who's ever been told, raise your hand silently if you want, to think about singing with a ping pong ball in your mouth. That's talking about mouth space and a little bit of palatal lift. So if you're thinking about that space inside and you hum, it's going to be more like than it is. We can also go to the extreme nasal, and I don't know how well this is coming through the microphone. You have to pardon me if it's not, but we can get hypernasal and go a real and really press. You can have your jaw together, palate is down, really forcing the air through the nose. We're not going to be doing that very much in the act of singing. Okay. So then there comes the question of, should I lift my palate? Some teachers talk extensively about yawn space, or if you look at the back of your throat with your hand mirror, you should be able to visualize the back wall of your pharynx in the oropharynx department. And some teachers advocate more of just allowing for the space to be there and modulating that space based on the range that one is singing in, trusting the muscles to adjust as you get a little bit higher in the space. Now I'm realizing that I'm going to have to plug my computer in, but I can do it surreptitiously and continue talking. Thank you, 2 years of doing things over Zoom, I suppose. I just don't want to lose you in the middle of the presentation. Now, the answer to this question is you really don't have to forcefully lift your palate to attain good palatal position for singing. You do need to be aware that it is movable and that it's a very flexible structure, and it can really do a lot for you in, say, in the Western classical style. We want that lofted resonance place, so we want a raised palate. For the more non-classical styles, we used to be very fond of calling it CCM, or contemporary and commercial music. Language is evolving a little bit. Contemporary vocal styles, non-classical styles, whatever we want to say. But in general, some of those styles and genres require perhaps a lower, not quite such an elevated palate, and maybe even a different laryngeal position. But I want to, before we move on, talk about a quick exercise that you can find your ah position. Just think about that nice lofted sung ah. I realize for you phonetics fans in the room here that I did use the bright, this font results in a bright ah, as in like Boston and Pac, the ka ah, that's like the same as Italian caro, right? I don't mean you have to do the bright ah here, but just make an ah vowel. AH or AW, I like to, give my students that analogy a lot. So find that ah and just give yourself a, ah. Do a 5 note if you want. Just find that opposition. Now find your NG. Pretend like you are extending the end of the word hung and go. You can sing those same 3 pitches that I sang on an open ah while suspended in the NG. Now, I like to illustrate the interaction of the back of the tongue and the palate on that NG and go. Right? And you can keep the very same jaw position for as ah, ah, ah. You'll feel a little sort of disconnection when you decide to go to the ah, but knowing that we can do that hum, that palatal / nasal sound with the jaw in a neutral position is really, really a nice tool for us. Okay. So the last step of the process, and I know we're getting on in our time this evening, but I want to just come around with the pharynx and refresh our memory that there are really 3 sections. When we say oropharynx, we mean the space behind the mouth. I kind of make a loose analogy to the shape of a question mark, right? And the top of the question mark and the curve is really your nasopharynx, and the body, the first curve of that question mark is your oropharynx, right? So the oropharynx, oro behind the mouth, naso pertaining to the nose. And then we also have what's called the laryngopharynx. And that is the part of the tube that extends right above the vocal folds, right? So we want to be aware of our ability, for good or ill, like I said earlier, to constrict or relax this group of structures, right? Okay. When you are activating the abdominal part of your breath, one exercise that I like to use with my students, that we're going to talk about how this pertains to the pharynx too. Take your finger and plug one nostril, right? Take a nice deep, and close your mouth. Take a nice deep inhalation through the other nostril, like you're smelling a fragrant flower. If you do that, you're opening up your nasopharynx, quite free and relaxed and open. Okay. Take your mouth breath and go like you're walking down the stairs on Christmas morning and you see that present out that you wanted more than anything, right? cheekbones lift, palates lifts, we get lofted space, and we get lots of oropharyngeal space, okay? Now, get into that yawn position and just talk a few words. Good evening. Think about relaxing your throat as much as you can, right? Now, I'm going to say for the first time, don't focus on opening it or holding it open. Focus on relaxing it, right? Because the next thing that we'll be talking about is this idea of singing with an open throat. And what does that mean? And what is that desirable? What does it mean when my director or my teacher tells me to sing with an open throat? Before we do, we'll revisit the fact that the pharynx has respiratory and digestive function, right? It's a part of the airway system, but it's also part of the routing system. You'll see here the esophagus runs in as one tube, the trachea runs as another tube, right? It's interesting to me still, after the study that I've been part of and pertaining to the voice and the anatomy, that we forget that the position of the esophagus is behind, right? I mean, you see your Adam's apple, you're aware of your tracheal structures, but the fact that it's kind of a back tube, and that somehow ends up in the front in your stomach when you are digesting your food. Small wonders of the human body, I suppose. But the pharynx, from a resonance standpoint, is responsible for amplifying the waves that are sound waves that are created by the vibration of the vocal folds. Okay, we have a upper, middle, and lower constrictor muscle through especially the lower part of the pharynx, and by willing our throat to make a certain shape, there is a certain manner of perceived control, I like to say, of having control of the sound, the resonant sound that your voice is making. But regardless of if you are striving for a more contemporary non-classical sound or classical sound, we want to remove interrupters or things that would impede the sound. Sometimes there are style characteristics, right? Think about quintessential voices that had a very unique sound, right? There may be certain constriction that's going on that may have helped to establish that type of sound aesthetic. So it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means when we think about creating the most neutral environment, we want to think about not overly contracting these constrictor muscles. Okay. So the idea of an open throat. I quote my teacher and mentor and very treasured friend, Dr. Kari Reagan, in her book, which I happen to have right by me because I used it extensively getting ready for tonight's presentation, as I refer to it, it feels like nearly daily. In her articulation chapter, she says the pharynx is at its widest state when in a neutral position, right? When not being entangled by flexing of those constrictor muscles and getting in the way. Right? So in the idea of a brassy or twang resonance, more associated with contemporary styles, we want to shorten the vocal tract, or we want to have the idea of a megaphone that's the trumpet end of the megaphone is at the back and the open end of the megaphone is at the front. That means maybe a more spread frontal space, E's that spread this way, A's that spread that way, all these sort of things. Part of that aesthetic. For a lofted or generally more familiar to Western classical resonance, we have a lengthened vocal tract, or what we like to call the inverted megaphone, where the front space is not as large as the back space. And the soft palate plays a big role in that, as we've already said. Okay. It's really important not to force these structures to do something, not to force your mouth open, not to forcefully press your tongue against your back of the bottom teeth because your voice teacher told you to, not to try to artificially depress the larynx. We want a neutral laryngeal position. It may be neutrally lower for Western classical. In fact, we often have the analogy of palate up, larynx down, increased amount of space for that lofted resonance. Now, when we're talking about more contemporary, other genres, we still want it to be neutral. It may just be a little higher. Your palatal space may be a little bit less raised, but we still need a place for the sound to resonate and be developed and articulate on the way out. So one thing that we get to do as your voice teachers is help disentangle some of these processes that may have made their way in over the course of other habits in your life. Like I mentioned earlier, grinding your teeth or biting your nails. There may be other things that you're doing with your jaw or tongue muscles or other things that we could optimize with some work in the voice studio. Okay, so as we wrap up, I wanted to share a few of my resources that I think are very, very valuable. I mentioned Dr. Kari Reagan already. Her book is the fourth on the list here. Plural Publishing is a publishing company that commits themselves to lots of wonderful resources in the field of not only singing, but also speech-language pathology, and even on the medical side, on the laryngology side. They have a wonderful website. There's some wonderful titles there. I encourage you to explore for yourself. I also briefly mentioned Dr. Scott McCoy's book, which I have in other presentations as well. It's now in its third edition called Your Voice: An Inside View. It is a deep read, a deep dive, as I'm very fond of saying. That's something that Dr. Reagan is